welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. The United Nations has referred to the Rohingya as the most persecuted minority in the world. And yet, a recent report written by former Guatemalan former Prime Minister and UN Ambassador Gert Rosenthal highlights UN's systematic failure to take necessary action to prevent the massive human rights violations and ethnic cleansing in the region. The UN Chief Antonio Guterres accepts the report and acknowledges the UN's shortcomings. On tonight's show, we explore how much more could have been done by the world's most powerful international body, including the killing of more than 10,000 and the displacement of over 1 million Rohingya Muslims. Later on the show, we cover how hospitals in the last rebel-held area of Idlib in Syria have become one of the most dangerous places for civilians as airstrikes continuously target and destroy the healthcare facilities. But first, let's begin with the UN report on Myanmar. We welcome our guest to the show. Joining us today is Mr. San Lwin, a Rohingya activist and also the campaign coordinator of Free Rohingya Coalition. He is joining us from Frankfurt, Germany. Also with us today is Mr. Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch Asia Division, joining us from Bangkok. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. San Lwin, let me begin with you. And I do want your insight on the history of persecution of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. For that, I just want to refer to a tweet you wrote earlier. 27 years ago, UN described Rohingya as the most persecuted minority in the world. Since then, tens of thousands have been killed, 1 million are confined in camps. In Burma, they exist in open-air prisons. When will action be taken instead of empty words? Now tell us the long history of the persecution of the Rohingya Muslims and how this outdates far before the 2017 crackdown.
Yeah, actually, after the independence of Burma in 1948, we have the full citizenship right. We were recognized as the indigenous ethnic group of Burma. So, but our 1970, first of all, they removed us from the 144 ethnic group list. And then in 1974, they have taken away our national identity card. And in 1978, they have launched the massive violence against the Rohingya, which widely known as the Dragon King operation, resulted 270,000 fled to Bangladesh, but they were repatriated a few months later as a Rohingya. When they were pushed off from the country, they were labeled as the illegal Bengali immigrant from the Bangladesh, but they were accepted back as a Rohingya. But in 1982, they have implemented the new citizenship law, and we became stateless within our own country. Then again in 1991, they have launched another operation called PTIR, resulted about 300,000 fled to Bangladesh. Some of them are still remaining in Bangladesh. Some were repatriated in 1994 and 1995. So in 1992, the military regime imposed several restrictions against the Rohingya population who are mainly based, residing in northern Rakhine state, like, the freedom of movement, the access to social service, access to education, access to healthcare, marriage, birth restrictions, so many things. So since then, UN described this, the Rohingya as the most persecuted minority in the world, but they have not taken any single action against the Myanmar government. I am not saying about the system failure, that the UN has their own system, but the individual who are running this system, they are failing to add the law into the action. So in 2012, again, there are the massive violence against the Rohingya in central Rakhine and the northern Rakhine state, resulted 140,000 into the confined camp more than 7 years now.
And Mr. Lwin, from everything that you're telling us, this in-depth history, it seems that it wasn't a surprise or the world saw it coming. Whatever happened after 2017, the crackdown, which caused for the displacement of over 1 million people. even then, with all these warning signs, with knowing the indigenous context, the UN failed to take enough action that would prevent it, or at least failed to be involved actively. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. After 2017, they had their own report from the Human Rights Council, the fact-finding mission. They have released the report in September 2018. They have saying that that genocide is ongoing. That they have their own code known as the Wall Code or the International Court of Justice. They can take this case into the court, and
Right.
they can do many things, but they have not done anything yet.
Right. And Mr. Quinn, hold on to that thought. After that damning report that was released by an independent fact-finding body, there was an acknowledgement and there was an identification of all the grave human rights violations being conducted. So there was no misinformation coming out of Myanmar at that point, even though the Myanmar government did not acknowledge the report here. Mr. Robertson, talking about this report that was just recently released and was criticizing UN's involvement in Myanmar, what did you think about that report?
Well, it's a report that talks in generalities. It talks in terms of a system that didn't work, a lack of communication, a lack of coordination, two very different groups of people within the UN country team, one pushing the development agenda, the other one saying that we have to pay attention to human rights. And the failure by the UN resident coordinator to basically pull these sides together. And more than that, actually, she downplayed completely the whole issues of human rights and the concerns that people, even in her own staff, were reporting to her that, the indications look like the situation is getting much worse. And she decided to ignore that. So quite clearly, this is a report that has talked about generalities, but it has failed to assign blame to specific individuals. Once again, we have a report where the UN is saying, we made mistakes, we didn't do the things we should have done, but no one is held accountable, and the world continues on. I think really this is a check the box kind of exercise for the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He realized he needed to have a report. He wanted to close the chapter on this, and that's what he's done with this report, so he thinks.
Right. And I do want to talk more about the fact that, as you were saying, this is closing the chapter and ticking a box, and what this means for Myanmar in the international realm a little more. But before that, something that you talked about was that there were two sides of the information that was coming out from Myanmar. One that was talking about the democratic process, and one that was talking about the human rights violations. Why do you think at one in time the democratic process was given more weightage or greater importance? And do you think that was the case for all the United Nations member states?
No, I mean, it wasn't the democratic process. It was the development process. It was a school of thought that believed that if they could just figure out how to bring economic development to Rakhine State, that everything would be fine, that the animosity between the Rohingya and the Rakhine would be ended, that the repression that the Rohingya were suffering would be ended. And that was just, frankly, a very facile, simplistic way of approaching this. But this was the approach that the UN resident coordinator, Renata Lokdesalian, decided to go with. And she actively blocked efforts by officials from the Office of High Commissioner on Human Rights and from the Office of Coordination of Human Affairs, OCHA, who disagreed with her, to play a role in the decision-making process, to the extent of even instructing her staff to schedule meetings when representatives of those agencies were known to be out of town.
Right.
So quite clearly, there was an effort by the UN resident coordinator to completely dismiss the kind of warnings that she was getting from the ground from people who were trying to get the word across that something needed to be done. And what we've seen ultimately in the sort of really in the last sort of 7 years, starting from 2012, when there were two violent incidents, once in June and the other one in October, and then also in October 2016, was that at each time the Burmese military and security forces and also ethnic Rakhine militia were able to abuse Rohingya, kill Rohingya, rape Rohingyan women, and not be held accountable. And the takeaway from that is that we can do it again. And that was ultimately the massive crimes against humanity and possible genocide that took place starting in August 2017.
Right. And Mr. Robertson, one of the things that the report mentions for the systematic failures and shortcomings is that the information coming from Myanmar, even from the UN bodies and independent fact-finding bodies, was conflicting. At some points, it said that these are natural up and downs for this country, and at other points, it was actually alarming towards a grave human rights violation. Now, when we're talking about this issue specifically, and we do know there are complexities of going on the ground and finding out the true picture, but what do you think could the United Nations have done differently?
Well, it's very clear that they had a mandate to do human rights up front. That was something that Ban Ki-moon, as the UN Secretary General, had prioritized. And actually, Myanmar was considered to be a pilot case, a pilot country for this new approach. Unfortunately, it was never given an opportunity to work. It was essentially sidelined by the UN resident coordinator and other people around her. What they should have been doing is they should have been saying, look, we want to be into these areas. We're going to demand access, and other thing, they had to get tough with the Myanmar government. They had to say you have to hold people accountable for past abuses, and you have to allow humanitarians into these areas.
Right.
Otherwise,
Mr. Robertson, hold on to that thought. I want to bring Mr. Lwin into this conversation and ask him about the on-ground reality of the Rohingya Muslims at this point in time, and if it is a good idea to close this chapter, as Mr. Robertson said, that's the intention of the United Nations.
First of all, they have to bring this criminal, Myanmar military criminal who have committed the genocide against the Rohingya people. They have to bring to the justice. This is what the Rohingya people are demanding. The Rohingya refugee community and the diaspora community are demanding this. The second is they have to return to their original places in northern Rakhine State and the central Rakhine. There are the 140,000 Rohingya refugees are confined into the camp for more than 7 years now. First of all, if they want to bring back the Rohingya survivor from the Bangladesh, they have to settle this matter first. They have to restore all their citizenship right, everything. Then, they can convince the people, the survivor in Bangladesh. So everything. What we are asking is the human dignity. We don't have the human dignity inside our own country, and our fellow Buddhists in Myanmar, they are not considering us the human. They are treating us like a subhuman. So we are powerless people. We don't have anything. We are helpless. We are depending on the international community. The United Nations is the world's largest organization, and it has been running for 73 years. They have been solving a lot of problems. So they are failing to act in the Rohingya. Now they have to change. Today, our Free Rohingya Coalition, all the resignation
and
of
Mr.
the UN.
Lwin, all the words you're saying, you're definitely describing the scene here that the United Nations has been established for far too long to come up with these excuses of being ineffective. Mr. Robertson, last question to you. Is this unprecedented for the United States to come out and say, oh, we made a mistake and sorry for the genocide? This has happened in Rwanda. This has happened in Sri Lanka. There are various instances of it as it has happened in Sudan. Will the United Nations learn this time around as well?
Well, you pointed out very clearly that there have been previous failures. There have been other instances where genocide and crimes against humanity took place. The UN missed the opportunity to stop that, both in Rwanda and Sri Lanka. And after Sri Lanka, there was a very comprehensive report that was done that outlined those failures, and that was why the Human Rights Upfront Plan was actually brought up. This was the response of the system, and the system failed to implement it in Myanmar, and nobody was held accountable for that failure. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, what you're talking about is a United Nations which continues to write reports and continues to have resolutions but it cannot seem to overcome the divisions within the member states. That is one point that this report makes that's important, that the UN Security Council should have taken action on this.
But the interesting point here is
a very clear situation where they needed to act and they didn't.
Right. And Mr. Robertson, sorry for interrupting here, but as the report mentioned that there needs to be better coordination between the member states, and as you mentioned, the Human Rights Upfront Act that was brought in 2014, that stated that there needs to be a change to the UN engagement with member states. It already identified that as being a weakness. It already pointed out that that needs to be something that needs to be rectified. There is no mistake that there is a flaw in the system, but can we realistically expect this flaw for being corrected in the near future?
Well, I mean, I do think that the United Nations can learn lessons. I mean, I do think that, if this report had actually named names and required some people to be thrown out of the UN service, including the UN resident coordinator who presided over this mess, we would see some action here. But since no one has been held accountable, this report just seems to be inconvenient. And now Renata, the UN resident coordinator, has effectively been promoted. She's now the UN resident coordinator in India.
Right.
I have to ask whether she's going to stand up to human rights abuses by the Modi government. I rather doubt it.
And
she has a track record of failure, and she should not be in the system anymore.
Right. And that's a very strong statement to give at the end, Mr. Robertson. That is very thought-provoking, that if there isn't accountability within the United Nations itself, how can the United Nations hold other people accountable? On that note, I'll have to thank both of my guests for joining us for this segment, Mr. Nay San Lwin and Mr. Phil Robertson. Thank you both. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we will discuss Syria's healthcare crisis in detail. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Hospitals in Syria's province, Idlib, have become one of the most dangerous places for civilians as they are targeted by airstrikes. According to the World Health Organization, 70% of total worldwide attacks on healthcare facilities, ambulances, services, and personnel have occurred within Syria. On tonight's show, let's take a closer look at why hospitals are being targeted and the impact of this. Joining us for the show and the discussion today is Maram Susli, who's an activist joining us from Perth. We're also joined by Mr. Hadi Wahab, who's a Middle East expert. He's joining us from the UK. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Maram, let me begin with you. Tell us the condition of healthcare infrastructure in Syria and the bombings that are taking place in Idlib right now.
Well, before the war began, Syria had one of the best healthcare systems in the entire region. They produced their own pharmaceuticals. They were 98% self-sufficient, which means they didn't have to import pharmaceuticals from overseas. Unfortunately, when the war began, a lot of the insurgents would loot pharmaceutical companies, the factories, and they would sell these drugs to try to make money to fuel their war. Of course, the insurgents, the rebels as they're being called, have also targeted hospitals on the government-controlled side. However, they've also set up a lot of field hospitals all along the front lines of Idlib. And as a result of these field hospitals, which are not established they're not like known hospitals that existed before the war. They're sort of makeshift hospitals for the fighters. As a result, there's all these hospital attacks because of the amount of field hospitals that the rebels have organized. Also, the rebels have a tendency to garrison buildings, which sometimes include hospitals. When they garrison such buildings, they use it as a means of warfare, not to be used as a hospital per se. The problem is that Al-Qaeda is controlling Idlib. It is widely accepted and known by the United Nations and the US that Al-Qaeda is the strongest force fighting the Syrian army in Idlib. It's also the strongest force in Idlib altogether. So unfortunately, the Syrian government has no choice but to go in and continue to fight these people.
Right. And Mr. Wahab, on that point that Maram about, that these rebels are within Idlib and they often use hospitals as garrisons, and that's why there is no choice but to attack these hospitals. Do you agree with that point?
I do agree. I would say that in wars, civilians are always scapegoats. There's always civilian losses everywhere. But I guess the United States is fighting Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and the Syrian army is fighting Hayat Tahrir Sham, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda in Idlib. Therefore, the United States and the West can't go out on public and state that the Syrian army is killing civilians, because these are like collateral damage, unfortunately, in every war. And the same thing is happening in Afghanistan, and the same thing happened when they fought the Islamic State in Syria and in the Kurdish areas. Right. So these are...
Mr. Wahab, on that point that civilians are always the scapegoats, tell us a little more about that. The way civilians are being impacted when these hospitals are attacked or they are raided or airstrikes are conducted on them.
From the beginning, Idlib became a sanctuary for all the so-called rebels. Currently, most of them are not rebels, although in the beginning, many were like Syrians and rebels, and that's true. But now Hayat Tahrir Sham is dominating Idlib. And this is a buffer zone under the protection of Turkey, which is now, we can say that it is occupying an Arab land. And this is a formal occupation. Now, this might need later on a political, let's say, bargain to solve the solution. But unfortunately, this is gonna cost a high, let's say, casualty tolls, and this is gonna. When the Syrian army is gonna capture Idlib, we're gonna have another refugee crisis, and that's for sure, because the rebels there, or let's say Hayat Tahrir Sham and other pro-Turkish rebels, they have no other choice, or they're gonna fight. Right. Or they're gonna die. They have no other solution, and a lot of civilians are gonna die in this battle unless something else happened, a bargain between Turkey, Russia, Iran, and the Syrian regime.
And definitely that's something that the UN chief has also reiterated just not long ago, that there needs to be a political solution to this war, and only then can a good outcome or a meaningful outcome come out of the situation. Thank you so much, Mr. Hadi Wahab, for joining us and providing us insight. I'm back to you. Now, you talked about the state of hospitals and how the rebels raided them, took out the supplies, and the system collapsed almost ever since this conflict broke out. Now, the US-based Physicians for Human Rights documented more than 500 attacks on more than 350 medical facilities between 2011 and 2018. And 90% of these were done by the Syrian and Russian government forces. Now, tell us the other side to the story here as well. Government and the Russian forces being responsible for attacking these not just now, but ever since the conflict broke out.
The United States as a source, you can't really trust anything they're saying, because they're actively occupying Syria and were responsible for murdering thousands and thousands of civilians, and including bombing hospitals where there were babies in incubators that were strewn all over the floor in Raqqa. So we know this for a fact, and the US has a very long history of bombing hospitals. So of course, the fact that they are saying this about Russia and Syria are not only an attempt to deflect from their own war crimes, but because, of course, they had an agenda against Syria,
All right.
because of Syria's position against Israel.
Right.
So we cannot really trust them as a source.
All right. But what about the source coming from within Syria? Doctors who stated that they no longer will share coordinates of hospitals with the United Nations ever since they found that 25 of the hospital coordinates that they shared, 9 of them were attacked by Russian forces.
Well, the thing is that it's interesting that you would say doctors from within Syria, because are these Syrian doctors? You know, some of these people are coming from the United States and they are very, very sympathetic towards Al-Qaeda. The problem is that they are creating these makeshift hospitals that are not established buildings. These are houses that they've occupied, that they've turned into field hospitals. Now, field hospitals are on the front lines of the war. So, of course, on the front line is going to be the most dangerous place. So it's like creating a hospital and then complaining about the fact that, you know, you put it in the middle of a front line and you're complaining about the fact that it was bombed. It doesn't work that way. You can't create a hospital and use it as an excuse for media. They're using civilians as human shields.
Right, but you're saying doctors coming from the United States who would be sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, wouldn't doctors coming
United
from...
Kingdom, sorry.
All right. Wouldn't doctors coming from anywhere in the part of the world risking their lives, wouldn't their main motivation be to serve the civilians as opposed to play into political motives?
You would think, however, you know, the United Kingdom has actually banned some doctors from returning to the UK for fear of their terrorist links. So obviously, if the United Kingdom doesn't feel secure enough to take its own citizens back who are doctors, you know, why should Syria trust them? You know, some of these doctors were implicated in the torture.
But then they wouldn't be serving the agenda of the United Kingdom.
In Syria, you know, the NHS doctor who kidnapped and faced trial for kidnapping a British journalist that came to Syria, you know, that is a widely known story. So, of course, unfortunately, you know, doctors are supposed to follow this oath. But if they have Al-Qaeda sympathies, they're going to go and fight or be doctors for Al-Qaeda.
Right. Maram, but tell us, how are the civilians at the end of the day are the ones who are suffering?
Absolutely. I mean, the unfortunate thing for the civilians is they can't control the situation they're in. They are being, whether they're sympathetic to the rebellion, whether they are against the government or with the government, in Idlib, the civilians are in a situation that's outside of their control. They cannot escape it. They're not allowed to cross into government-held areas because they're stopped from doing so by the rebel groups themselves or by the Turkish government that doesn't allow them to cross the border as refugees anymore. So it's an impossible situation that they find themselves in. And unfortunately, unless some safe corridors can be negotiated to get them out, the civilians are going to be the ones that suffer the most.
Right. And hold on to that thought. We're also joined by Ms. Vanessa Beeley, who's going to tell us a little more about the situation. She's a journalist from France. Ms. Vanessa, give us your take on all of this, the situation, the reports coming out, and the more we hear about the airstrikes being conducted and being carried out on hospitals.
Well, I mean, this hospital narrative is something that we've seen during every single Syrian Arab Army allied campaign to liberate areas occupied by NATO-backed, Gulf state-backed terrorist groups that are dominated by Nusra Front or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a rebrand, which is basically in control of Idlib province. We have to remember that Brett McGurk last year described Idlib as the largest al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. So we shouldn't be ignoring this fact. And what we've seen throughout every campaign in East Aleppo, in Eastern Ghouta, in the south of Syria, all areas that are now fully liberated and that are restoring themselves after terrorist occupation, what we saw were the majority of the hospitals and the schools, and I saw this personally in East Aleppo and in Eastern Ghouta and in the south, the majority of schools and hospitals were taken over by the military armed groups, particularly by Nusra Front and the dominant extremist gangs in each particular area, and they were being used as Sharia courts as prisons, as detention centers, as torture chambers for civilians that would not comply with their ideological tyranny. And therefore, they ceased to be effectively hospitals. What we're also seeing in Idlib, again, as I said, is the same media propaganda regarding the targeting of hospitals. But I need to make clear here, there are officially 34 hospitals, 4 public and 30 private in Idlib. And they are claiming that up to 27 have been.
And on that point, Vanessa, hold on to that thought. I also want to introduce Ahmed Al Husein, who's an aid worker joining us from Idlib. Thank you so much, Ahmed, for joining us. Now, give us an on-ground situation, a picture of the on-ground situation, civilians' mobilization, their mobility, how it's been restricted, and the infrastructure damage that is being done, and what is the situation like right now?
Hello, and thank you for this opportunity to join you. I'm Ahmed Al Husein. Actually, the field situation in Syria is almost known to everybody because we have been through 9 years of conflict in Syria. The destruction of the infrastructure is being severe, and about 80 to 90% of each village from the north of Syria is destroyed. We are talking about hundreds of villages that have been destroyed, and recently the attacks and raids have become more and more, which caused the people to be displaced, and more than 250,000 people displaced in the last attack of the Syrian regime or Assad regime and the Russian forces.
Right. And give us a sense of the aid delivery and the conditions of delivering medical supplies, food, and other basic necessities right now.
Actually, the Russian forces and Assad regime are trying to encapsulate the hospitals and medical points. Many people or hospitals are working there, but the airplanes always target hospitals to incapacitate. So to make them out of service. When the hospital is out of service, the people can't stay there because if someone got injured, sometimes the wounds are so severe and dangerous, so they can't be delivered to hospital because the hospital is out of service. And this way has been used many times during the last campaign against Idlib.
Right.
We saw about 4 to 5 hospitals have been destroyed.
Right. And Ahmed, would you say that the mainstream media covering Syria is getting an accurate depiction of what is happening there, especially when it comes to targeting infrastructure and the reasons behind why it's being targeted? Or what would the story be coming out of Idlib itself?
Okay. Actually, they are saying that targeting the terrorism and terrorist groups. We do not deny that there are some Islamic groups are working here, but they are working accordingly with civilians. They are not doing something harmful. They are just trying to protect. And also, we used to know about the Free Syrian Army, who are the people, our brothers, and our relatives and the children of our country who refused to kill the innocent civilians and defected from the Assad regime. So Assad regime tried to make the thing that he's fighting terrorism, against terrorism, but they are just killing women and children. They are not able to move forward using their military forces, so they are using this to make the pressure, to make us under pressure and suffer more. They are targeting our homes. Even my country, it is a small village in the south of Idlib. It is almost destroyed by the criminal regime and the Russian forces. We are just civilians and aid workers. We are not military people. Even if they are trying to fight against the military people, they are not targeting them. They are just targeting the civilians to put pressure upon the military forces.
Right, but why would they be targeting civilians to put up more pressure on the forces, militia forces there? And do you think that is a tactic that is going to work?
actually it's not going to work because we all know that the people who stood against Assad regime will have no future if the Assad regime reclaims Syria again. They will just be massacres, and we are going to be killed or put to prison or imprisoned for many years because we just asked for our freedom and asked for our human rights. But they did not understand it and tried to use force to stop our revolution. Then they turned into using weapons.
Right.
Some people.
Right. And thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed Al Husein, for joining us and giving us insight of what is happening on ground. Maram, back to you. Tell us about the conditions of displacement, how widespread it has been. 6.6 million people have reportedly been displaced ever since the conflict broke out. How is that impacting everyday life?
Well, actually, it's 4 million that became refugees outside of Syria, but actually something like 6 million became internally displaced. And that has impacted the Syrian economy a great deal. They have to feed and house these people. And unfortunately, the US sanctions has made it even more difficult for these people to survive. And it just goes to show, like, unlike what your guest is saying, most people do not want to live under Al-Qaeda. And that's why the internally displaced refugees are coming towards these Syrian government-controlled areas. And the fact that the Al-Qaeda foreigners are continuing the war in Syria, continuing to fight in Idlib, what is the end game here? They're not going to defeat the Syrian army. They're not going to take over Damascus. They're not going to overthrow the Syrian government. So what they would like to do is control Idlib indefinitely and create a separatist state. But the Syrian state is not going to allow its sovereignty to be broken up like this, nor is it going to allow an Al-Qaeda pocket to exist. And as a result, what is the end solution here? They claim to care about civilians, your guest claims to care about civilians, but obviously logic dictates that the Syrian military is going to go in, and those that are fighting and are using the civilians as a shield and propaganda are not really caring about the welfare of civilians.
Right. And Vanessa, on that point that Maram is talking about, what is the end game here? Let's talk a little about what space there is during conflicts like these for the international community to play a role. And what space is there in terms of Syria that the international community can step in for the civilians, not just for the political parties here or the forces on either sides?
Well, if we're talking about the international community, we're generally talking about the US coalition of intervention that has been responsible for the war in Syria, the destruction of Syria, the misery of the Syrian people for 8 years. So I think the last thing that Syria needs is for the international community to step in. They've already stepped in a very, very destructive way. One point that I would like to make, if we're talking about the safety of civilians, the Al-Qaeda that your last guest claimed were protecting people targeted Al-Wahidi village 2 days ago, killing 12 people during a wedding. They attacked a medical center, injured 16 others. And over the last 8 years, the terrorist groups, whether it's the Free Syrian Army that is under the control of Nusra Front, have been targeting the border towns that are in the government secure areas, including Skelbie, including Mahade, both Syrian Christian towns, whose hospital centers and medical centers, schools, monasteries have been targeted systematically by these groups. This is a defensive campaign by the Syrian Arab Army and by the Syrian government to prevent further violations of the deconfliction zone and to prevent further massacres of their own civilians, and also to save the civilians that are under occupation in Idlib. We've seen it every time an area is liberated. People come home, they come back to government secure areas. And we see that also with the refugees that you've talked about before that are coming back, and they're coming back because areas have been liberated from these terrorist groups that we're being told are there to protect civilians. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. What the international community should do is to stop funding and financing these terrorist groups and providing them aid and equipment while starving the 80% of Syria that is back under the protection of the Syrian government through sanctions, preventing the hospitals providing treatment for their own civilians through sanctions because they are not receiving even the most basic equipment, and stop supplying arms, weapons, equipment to the terrorist groups that are still occupying areas of Syria.
Vanessa, hold on to that thought. I also want to introduce Christiane Waked, who's a political analyst who's joining us from Beirut. Thank you so much, Christiane, for joining us. Now, we're talking about the situation in Syria and how Vanessa also reiterated here that the last thing that needs to be done is for the international community to step in or to play a role. What do you see happening in the conflict in the near future? Where do you see it heading?
Hello. Yes, indeed, the international community must play an important role because since ongoing from the beginning of the war in Syria, exactions are committed from both sides, but mostly from the government regime, especially regarding hospitals, universities, schools. The international community must act, and there must be a calling on all countries to sign a sort of safe schools and safe hospitals declaration, a sort of pledge to protect these institutions from attack and military use. The more countries make that pledge, the more governments like those in Damascus and Moscow will be isolated, and governments will feel the pressure of their communities to put an end to such exactions. Now, the UN security must do its best to implement UNSC resolution for the protection of medical facilities and aid workers. The world must understand that as long as there is injustice and as long as the Assad regime will continue to murder and terrorize civilians on a massive scale, this will give justification for terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and Daesh to recruit new members and perpetrate crimes not only in Syria but in Europe, the US, and any part of the world.
Right.
These crimes will continue to generate massive refugees flows. And also, we have to remind Mr. Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian army, even if it's a bit too late, that when you are in a power position and you represent the Syrian government, your first duty is to protect the civilians, even if there is a civil war. An army cannot behave like a militia and must, before anything, be an example for others. If it doesn't want retaliation from the other side, it must lead by example.
Christiane, hold on to that thought while I put my next question to you. And I really do want to reiterate on the human picture of this conflict, the human face to this conflict. Tell us regarding that. Tell us more about that, the pain and the suffering of the people on ground.
Of course, on ground, people are suffering because, just to let you know, overall, more than 4,000 schools, that means 40% of school infrastructures in Syria, are out of condition, destroyed and damaged. Like that, this means over 2 million children. That is one of third population are out of school. And now more than 1.3 million children are still at risk of dropping out. And regarding the hospitals, the situation is disastrous. Some hospitals, like these past months, some hospitals were completely destroyed on the ground, especially in Idlib, where the Syrian government and Russian forces are pushing an offensive against the last opposition bastion in Idlib.
And thank you so much, Ms. Christiane Waked, for joining us and talking to us about the situation here. We're now joined by Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, who's the chairman and founder of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. He's joining us from Switzerland. Mr. Ghany, we're talking about children, and that's something that Ms. Christiane, our earlier guest, was also talking about. Tell us the lost generation of Syria here during this conflict, the way they are losing out on almost all the basic human rights, whether it is education or healthcare, and the impact that's having on the Syrian people.
Of course, that's a terrible situation in Syria, and all of the different types of violation affected the children hardly as a vulnerable victims, actually. But always we need to recognize that between the types and the scale of violation, when the government use the army and the security forces and the air forces, plus the Russian forces and the Iranian militia, all together to committed violation, that's very much different from when groups committed violation. The scale is different. The tactic is different also. We committed all the violation. That's very clear in our report. But targeting systematically and widespread, that tactic coming from the regime, chilling the medical centers, and chilling that is a tactic from the regime. The schools as well, that lead to the children to be displaced, lead the children to abandon the school. The family does not send their children again to the school. Schools have been targeted repeatedly. Well documented, above than 3,000 schools have been targeted. Most of them, above 90% from them, by Assad regime and his allies, mainly the Russian forces, and the Assad allies, and the Russian also journalists keep denying our documentation, denying human rights.
Mr. Fadel, since we're running short on time, I just want to put my last question to you. The UN chief Antonio Guterres said that Russia and Turkey need to stabilize the situation. Now, this is a statement that, of course, is continuously given by the international community. There needs to be control over the situation. But do you see that happening anytime soon?
Of course not. The Russian, we need to always remember that the Russian will blocking the Security Council to move ahead and find solution to Syria. The Russian used veto to protect Assad regime 13 times. So what we are asking allies, civilized allies, including civilized country and Islamic country like Pakistan, like also to be neutral, like Arab country, like Jordan, like Turkey, like France, UK, US, Canadian, Australian, to be interfere and in this conflict militarily to protect the civilians and to pressure the regime to sit at the negotiation table. Otherwise, the regime will continue committed crimes, killing civilians. So responsible to protect should be implemented out of the Security Council, similar what's happened when NATO interfered in Yugoslavia and to protect the civilians. Otherwise, Milosevic will kill thousands, similar what Bashar al-Assad did.
And on that note, thank you so much, Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, for joining us and to us. Maram, last question to you and to our other guest, Vanessa here. What do you think needs to change about the narrative regarding Syria and the conflict that's ongoing? What change do you think it's important to bring about in that story?
I think the mainstream media narrative that they seem to believe they have the moral high ground, that the international community should act against Assad, that's the narrative that needs to change. What is the international community? Is it the United Nations? Because the United Nations needs to act to protect the sovereignty of nations. And right now, there are currently 2 illegal occupations happening in Syria by the Turkish military and the American military and its allies. If the international community can do anything, it is to pressure these countries to end the violation of the United Nations Charter and end their illegal occupation of Syria and theft of its resources and perpetual attempt to balkanize the country. And the idea of calling the foreign al-Qaeda militants the Syrian opposition, this needs to change. This kind of language can no longer be acceptable.
Right. And Vanessa, do you agree with whatever Maram said as the last word there?
Of course, and I think what is extraordinary with your last guest, Mr. Ghany, is that basically we have what is effectively a humanitarian NGO calling for military intervention. He compared the situation in Syria to the NATO intervention in former Yugoslavia. That is an appalling statement to be made by who should be a neutral humanitarian NGO focusing on the destruction inside Syria, but also the invasion of sovereign territory and the effects on civilians of the attacks by what he calls the opposition, the Syrian opposition. And also one final point that I really want to make, the Syrian Arab Army represents the Syrian people. It is a conscript army. It is made up of the Syrian people. It
Vanessa,
is not...
I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there on that note, on that point. Thank you so much for joining us and so much, Maram, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week. Till then, goodbye and take care.